disunity, instability, and bitterness. Okay, now in order to really get a sense of how all of this is resolved, I want to skip chapters 2 and 3 and draw your attention to the structure of chapter 4, in which we really have this very strong sense of resolution, of resolving all of the conflicts and the tensions and the problems of chapter 1. In this chapter, once again, Naomi is the focus, which is not true about the two middle chapters. So that itself draws our attention to the comparison between the two chapters. The structure, of course, of this chapter is directly related to chapter 1 in backward order, in chiastic structure, in which in this first part of the chapter, Boaz welcomes Ruth into Beit Lechem, into his home. This is, of course, the opposite of Naomi pushing Ruth away from Beit Lechem. We begin chapter 4 with the meeting between Boaz and the Goel and the 10 men at the city entrance, in which Boaz publicly declares his intentions to bring Ruth into the Jewish people, into Beit Lechem, whether through the means of the Goel or by himself. In the second part of this chapter, we once again turn our attention to the connection between Naomi and the women of Beit Lechem. Once again, we have a conversation between Naomi and the women. However, this conversation is very different than the previous one, and there are some very strong correlations between the two discussions. So if, for example, at the end of Perek Aleph, Naomi twice says, Al tikrena li Naomi, and then the second time she uses the word karena. Karena li mara, the word vatikrena appears twice in the conversation between Naomi and Ruth in Perek Daled in chapter 4, in which it says, Vatikrena lo shem lemor yulad ben leNaomi, and they called him a name. The name, of course, is given to the newborn child. They gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi, Vatikrena lo Oved hu avi Yishai avi David, and they give him a name. So twice Naomi loses her name in Perek Aleph, and in Perek Daled, through the birth of this child, through the blessings, through the celebration, and the naming, we have here the exact opposite, the resolution of the problems of Perek Aleph. Of course, in this final section of the book, Ruth is acknowledged. She is the one who has been the catalyst for this resolution, as opposed to Naomi absolutely ignoring Ruth at the end of Perek Aleph, such that it is not even clear that she's standing there, because she's not mentioned at all. We get a sense that she's some sort of appendage, perhaps cowering in the background at the end of Perek Aleph, whereas by the end of chapter 4, we see Ruth very much at the forefront of the events. Even though she is not there, she is the one who is mentioned, right? She is mentioned as the one who is better for Naomi even than 10 sons, right? Better than 7 sons. And of course we have here the epilogue at the end of Perek Daled, which matches the introduction. If the introduction tells us about the past, which was 10 years, the epilogue tells us about the future, which is 10 generations from Peretz until we get to David, which is, of course, the goal of this story. The goal of the story is to get to the monarchy, and one of the things that I'm really trying to point out here is how important it is that the background of the monarchy is this very harmonious story in which the structure really underscores the harmony. So we have the Perek Daled, which is the resolution of the personal tragedy. We have the unity of the people. We have the stability of the story. The word bayit is mentioned 5 times in a very concentrated manner in Perek Daled. And the sense is that we've resolved all of the problems of Perek Aleph, the flux and the tragedy and the lack of certainty of Perek Aleph. Now in both of these chapters, both in chapter 1 and in chapter 4, Naomi is the center. The narrative recounts her tragedy. It is her line that the Migillat is seeking to perpetuate. Her story, therefore, is the periphery of the book. It appears at the beginning and at the end. We begin and end with her. Nevertheless, as we well know, of course, the name of the book is Megillat Ruth. The pivotal character in this book is Ruth herself. And she is the one who functions at the center of both chapter 2 and chapter 3, meaning she is the catalyst that brings about the resolution of Naomi's tragedy. The force of her character lies at the heart of the narrative, and she is the one that propels Naomi's turnaround. She is the one that brings about the return to stability and the restoration of of her future. And the most striking thing that I want you to note about these two chapters is that their internal structure is so profoundly parallel. If in chapter 1 and chapter 4 we saw a sort of reverse structure, in chapters 2 and 3 we see a directly parallel structure. Each of these chapters begin by telling us of a conversation between Ruth and Naomi back in Beit Lechem. That's the first scene in both of these chapters. Each of these chapters continue with the meeting of Ruth and Boaz out in the open, either in the field or in the goren, right, or in the threshing house. And each of these chapters end with Ruth coming back to Naomi and conferring upon Naomi that which she received from Boaz. And this, I think, creates a very strong sense of harmony, of structure. If you look with me for a moment at this second row here of chapter 2, we begin with a conversation, of course, between Ruth and Naomi regarding the problem of food, in which Ruth offers to resolve the problem of food. Now, of course, that's the same topic when we get to the field. We get to the field, and of course, who resolves the problem for Ruth? Boaz, right? Boaz solves Ruth's problem of food, which only leaves one scene left, which is Ruth coming back to Naomi and giving her that which Boaz had conferred upon Ruth herself, right? And she gives her both, right? She gives her both the food in the short term. She saves for her from the meal that she ate that day, right? What she left over from her satiation. And she also gives Naomi the ephah of seurim, which is, of course, 10 times the amount that one person can eat in one day. That's how much an ephah is. And so what she's giving her is a promise of food for the rest of the year, right? The harvest season only lasts 2 months, and so we need to pick about 5 times the amount each day in order for one person to survive. But she's looking, of course, to perpetuate both herself, her own survival, and that of Naomi. And so the ephah is a promise of survival through the winter. And so the result of chapter 2 is the resolution of the physical problem, the problem of food. Now, although, of course, chapter 2 settles the problem of the material security of Naomi's family, we still have the more existential problem, which is, of course, the future. Will this family continue? Underlying this question, of course, we know, is the fate of the nation. Because, of course, what has caused the nation to spiral out of control into chaos in Sefer Shoftim is the lack of a king. Bayamim hahem ein melech b'Yisrael, ish hayashar be'einav yaseh. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and so every man did that which he wanted. And so the question of will this nation succeed? Will there be a savior? Will there be someone who will ensure the future stability and harmony of the people and their land is also deeply buried in chapter 3, as well as chapter 2. Of course, we need to have physical survival in order to have continuity as well. And so the climactic chapter of Megillat Ruth is this 3rd chapter. Once again, Ruth is the focus. She's the only one that appears in all 3 scenes, and she is, of course, the conduit, right? And that's really, I think, largely the way Ruth sees herself, as the conduit to bring food from Boaz and children from Boaz to Naomi. We'll leave aside the question of why Boaz couldn't give that to Naomi himself. That's, again, for another topic. But here, once again, we start out the chapter with a conversation between Ruth and Naomi. In this case, it is Naomi who is determined to solve the problem of marriage/children. Ruth meets Boaz in the goren. It's incorrect, I wrote in the field here, but in the threshing house. And Boaz resolves Ruth's problem of marriage and children. Finally, Ruth comes back to Naomi at the end of this chapter and confers upon Naomi the food which Boaz gave to Ruth, the 6 sheaves, which of course symbolizes children, both in the Midrash, and I think it has to be also in the Pshat. And of course she tells Naomi the promise that Boaz has made to her regarding continuity. And the result of this chapter is the resolution of the metaphysical threat, the continuity, children. Both of these chapters have the same flow chart. Boaz provides for Ruth, Ruth provides for Naomi. From this point on, from chapter 3 on, the book loses most of its tension. The two problems have been resolved. There's no longer any doubt that the family will be perpetuated. The only question is how it will take place. Boaz grants Ruth food as well as marriage, and Naomi's family will indeed be perpetuated. This chapter ultimately leads us to the resolution in chapter 4, which we saw previously. Thus, I think the harmony of the story mirrors the ultimate goal of national harmony.